Welcome, my name is Thomas Brown. I'm the founder and clinical director of Equanimity Psychological Services, which is a central London psychotherapy and counselling service. And today I'm going to be continuing on with my obsessive compulsive disorder series, explaining the occurrences of obsessions and compulsions in a particular way, which will be Stanley Rachman's misinterpretation of significance model as to why obsessions and compulsions occur and what is it that keeps them going among OCD-prone individuals. My previous video described in full how an accurate diagnosis of OCD can be made. However, today I will recap briefly to explain the main features involved in obsessive compulsive disorder. I will then go on to describe Rachman's model of misinterpretation in relation to those symptoms and features. So around 1 to 2% of the general population in any country is diagnostic of obsessive compulsive disorder. And the disorder itself is characterised by repeated, unwanted, distressing thoughts, which are obsessions, and in most cases are also associated with frequent neutralising activities, such as compulsions. Obsessions themselves are repetitive, unwanted thoughts that cause distress. They're repeated and they usually affect people throughout the day. When they do feel uncontrollable, when they do feel as if people want to subjectively resist them and stop them, and they are at the same time very, very harrowing in a person's life, we can describe those clinically as obsessions. The content of obsessions generally tend to be the polar opposite of a person's core values. So if, for example, a person values very strongly sort of courteousness, non-violence, then the content of an obsession is very likely to include thoughts about causing harm, having caused harm. In the vast majority of cases, these obsessions are thoughts that come into people's minds, intrude into people's minds. However, around 17% of obsessions occur as impulses, so sudden urge to do something. And about 7% of obsessions occur as mental images, so an image in our mind of something unpleasant and not very nice. Obsessions generally fall into particular categories in terms of their content or what their themes include. Most commonly, contamination obsessions occur, and they are thoughts that we may have contracted or passed on germs either to another person, or they may affect our own health. Doubting obsessions are relatively common in OCD, and they are usually thoughts of not having done something that somebody feels they may be responsible for. So thought that have they turned the hob off? Are the windows closed while I'm out? But religious obsessions can also occur. So scrupulosity, sometimes referred to, a thought of doing something inappropriate to someone's cultural, spiritual, religious values. And precisionism can sometimes happen, whereby people feel they have to arrange objects in a particular way until it just feels right. Somatic obsessions sometimes occur, whereby people have repeated thoughts about some aspect or some part of their body that they think might not be right, might not be functioning properly. And harm obsessions are relatively common. The thought of causing harm to another person, either purposefully or by mistake. Did I run someone over last week, for example? Underpinning or revealing obsessions are fears, and usually fears of responsibility. So someone, for example, with pathological doubting, may fear that if they haven't turned the stove off, potentially a fire could occur, serious damage could occur, people could die. And this is really a sense of fear, responsibility, which tends to underpin and regulate the obsession itself. In about 99% of cases, people with clinical obsessions develop neutralizing strategies, so things that they will do in their day-to-day life to put right either the distress or the problem perceived with the obsession, or in some cases these neutralizing strategies are used to ward off any future adversity, so things going wrong. These can occur in a variety of different ways. Most widely known about are overt compulsion, so things that we do over and over in our behaviours. So for example, in the case of a cleaning obsession, the overt compulsion could be frequent cleaning, disinfecting. And in terms of other things like harm obsessions, people may do covert things, so they might pray in their minds, they might repeat lucky numbers which they see as important, or they may even reassurance seek, so they might ask other people, am I the sort of person who would cause harm? For these neutralizing strategies to be seen as clinically significant, they would be time consuming. For example, they would be taking up an hour or longer in someone's day to day. And they would be really dysfunctional. They would generally get in the way of people doing their day-to-day tasks, like getting to work, performing at work, remaining in relationships. So they are problematic in that way. A final note to mention about assigning OCD diagnosis is that a variety or a handful of general medical conditions and medications can actually induce OCD-like symptoms. And for OCD to be diagnosed as a psychiatric condition, it would not be related to a medical condition. So someone, for example, with Sydenham's chorea may harbour frequent twitches in their bodies. They might do repetitive behaviours, but that is to do with the general medical condition, and we wouldn't assign that to an OCD diagnosis. Other things like clozapine and antipsychotic medications, sometimes used in the UK, can induce symptoms of OCD, and in such cases, if the symptoms are induced that way, an OCD diagnosis would not be assigned. A different diagnosis would be assigned instead. Important to note when we're trying to understand obsessive compulsive disorder is that clinical obsessions derive from usual or universal phenomena of intrusive thoughts, so thoughts that pop into most people's minds. So sometimes they're referred to as normal obsessions, and in the vast majority of cases they don't lead to any sort of problem at all. In fact, researchers found that between 80 to 90% of the general population in any country generates these unwanted intrusive thoughts. An example might be if you are standing at a train station and a train is about to come into the station, we may have a sudden impulse or a thought to push someone in front of a train. So that would be an example of an intrusive thought. Similarly, if someone is sitting or standing in the kitchen chopping vegetables and a child walks into the room, you may generate a thought of stabbing that child. This is an intrusive thought. This is unusual and strange and may feel odd. It is an ego-dystonic thought, but normal intrusive thoughts do not lead to subjective, marked distress. People don't try and resist them, and they're not associated with any covert or overt neutralizing strategy. So these are what we refer to as normal phenomena. They have been called by Dr. Stephen Phillipson, one of the leading authorities in OCD research and treatment, as creative associations. They're things that our minds generate naturally throughout the day. He gave the example of saying that whenever he generates a creative association, he thanks his brain for producing this, lets it stay for a couple of seconds, and then lets it pass and carries on with his day without any issues, without any problems. As I'm about to explain, clinical obsessions come from our evaluations of our normal intrusive thoughts. A small minority, the 1 to 2% of people who create clinical obsessions evaluate these intrusive thoughts in a very negative way, as if there was a crisis, as if these thoughts are very not okay. Rachman's theory of misinterpretation of significance talks exactly about this. For any clinician or student interested in the origin of Rachman's theory, his theory is based upon David Clarke's panic model and Sarkovsky's inflated responsibility model, which I recently produced a video on. What Rachman believed was that the occurrence of obsessions occurs when people appraise and evaluate these normally occurring intrusive thoughts. What Rachman said, that people catastrophically misinterpret the meaning ascribed to these naturally occurring intrusive thoughts, thinking that it is something very bad, could lead to very serious consequences, such as someone actually causing harm, stabbing someone, thought that I might actually push someone in front of a train. And this is what leads to an intense distress and escalation of these normal intrusive thoughts into clinical obsessions. What Rachman added was that when people do become highly distressed from these clinical obsessions, they may manifest internal sensations of anxiety, such as trembling, such as sweating, and those might be deemed as signs that the person is about to lose control, so it can be reinforced belief from this. Rachman also said that when people are depressed, they're a lot more likely to make these misinterpretations because the content of their thinking is biased towards a negative outcome rather than a neutral outcome. So Rachman said that as long as people are misinterpreting the significance of these intrusive thoughts, obsessions are very likely to occur and persist. When these thoughts are appraised in a different way, in a non-catastrophic manner, obsessions are likely to either wane or disappear completely. Rachman said that the types of obsessions people are likely to harbour depends on their values, their system of values. So as I referred earlier on, someone who may be very, very courteous was likely to have intrusive thoughts that escalate into obsessions involving harm, killing somebody, for example. Someone who has very strong moral codes or religious codes, their thoughts may contain sort of blasphemy or doing something inappropriate or not right in a person's system of values. But why do some people think in this way? Why do people make these catastrophic misinterpretations about their normally occurring intrusive thoughts? Rachman proposed a cognitive vulnerability, a mental vulnerability that some people have that makes it much more likely for a person to make these misinterpretations. He proposed several means in which this goes on. One of the cognitive vulnerabilities comes in the form of a mental bias, a thinking bias. He referred to this as probability or likelihood thought-action fusion. And this essentially is a way of thinking in which we think that if something bad is about to happen, thinking about it makes it much more likely that it will happen in reality. So if, for example, I am thinking about my relative in a car, crashing the car, someone with this probability bias might think that it's much more likely the person will crash the car because I'm simply thinking about it. Rachman also proposed another form of cognitive or mental bias, which is called moral thought-action fusion. And this essentially says that people believe that having a bad thought is equivalent to or just as bad as actually doing it. So having a thought of killing somebody, for someone with this bias may think that that's just as bad as actually going out and doing it. So Rachman said both of these probability and moral thought-action fusion biases make it much more likely that people will create these misinterpretations. A final cognitive bias and also core belief that Rachman acknowledged from Sarkovsky was this sense of inflated responsibility. So this is either belief, a core belief, or a biased way of thinking in which we think that we have not only the ability, but we have the responsibility to avert harm in ourselves or for other people as soon as a bad thought like this happens. So to Rachman, having any three of these cognitive vulnerabilities, which is your thought, action, fusion bias, the moral kind, the likelihood kind, and this inflated responsibility is likely to lead to an increase in OCD symptoms and the onset and the maintenance of OCD symptoms. But what keeps these thoughts going? Why do they persist once they are there, once they're in someone's mind? Rachman said that believing that doing our neutralization strategies, either our praying in our mind or overt compulsions, believes that if that has been done and nothing bad happened to the person you worried about, or nothing bad happened to me, people can start to conclude that what they did in terms of their neutralization was effective, it worked. And had I not done it, then danger could have been a lot worse, bad things would have happened. So it is reinforced, this belief is reinforced because the compulsion or the neutralization strategy did lead to a good outcome. Another proposal that Rachman made was that actually engaging in neutralizing strategies, trying to avert harm, is a very elusive thing. If, for example, we want to ensure that the house is not going to catch fire while we're away, we may check the stove and recheck it. But actually, how many times do we need to check it to know that it's going to be safe? There isn't actually a real number. It's an elusive thing. So people habitually continue to check, and this may occur indefinitely because they just don't feel confident enough that what they did has actually prevented the likelihood of, let's say, a fire or something very, very bad from happening. Similarly, Rachman mentioned that when people engage in their neutralization strategies or their behaviors, their rituals, compulsions, their focus is very, very narrow most often because there's high levels of anxiety. They may be focusing on one thing that's really, really bothering them. And for that reason, their memory of what else is going on, like the details of how many times they've checked the stove, gets affected. So people don't feel confident they've done enough in order to avert harm, to stop bad things from happening.